have you ever stopped to ask, how do we really know what happened in the past with 100% certainty? That history is more of a mosaic of incomplete stories, documents, and interpretations, but none of these are time capsules. None of them are time machines, and none of them are perfect. They're just puzzle pieces, and a lot of times historians have huge pieces of the puzzle missing. What is history, and is it something that we can even trust? While it might help us to know the world around us, our past civilizations, our family, our culture, and maybe even ourselves a little bit better, can we actually trust what we've been taught? Let me ask you this. When you go to tell a story about your past, do you always tell it in the exact same words, the exact same tone, the exact same inflection, and with the exact same point in mind when you are telling it to your audience? Or does that story evolve based on your expertise at telling that story and how you've paid attention to how certain parts of that story land with your audience? And you've become a better storyteller, so you know how to still tell the truth, but maybe embellish it a little bit or use more engaging or emotional words. We've all grown up hearing about the important battles and conquest and wars in our history about great civilization. But is what we learned in school exact facts of the past? Or could it be potentially embellished based on what you do in your own life when you tell your own history? What is history, and is it something we can even trust? That is something we're going to explore today. Let's watch a little clip from Outlander where she's asking this exact question.
Everybody needs a history.
But how do you know it's true? What if he made it up to make you feel better?
Does it matter?
But that's my point. What is history? It's just a story. It changes depending on who's telling it. Like Paul Revere's, like Bonnie Prince Charlie's, like my parents, like my own. History can't be trusted.
Obviously, I'm not the only person in the world that has ever had these questions. What is history, and can we even trust it? These are actually great keywords that are titling this video so that hopefully other people will find us and start to think about history in this patriarchal lens that I keep on talking about. I'm super excited about these next couple of videos as we dive into what is history, what is myth, and how do they intermingle with each other, because this is really the meat of this season, and understanding how fluid these are, which you will be able to do by the end of this video and the next couple of videos. You will start to see that there might be some room for some change in how we view our history, and thus how we concoct our present and move into the future. A little reminder here, this is number 5 in a series of 13 videos, plus a trailer that gives you some additional information about the foundations of how I am building our mind, our frame of work, in order to help deconstruct patriarchy. There's going to be several seasons. I don't know how far we'll go with this, but make sure you go back and you watch those first 5 videos, the trailer, and then 1 through 4, and in order, because I'm building on concepts from video to video before you watch this. You can still watch this video and get the general concept, but these videos do relate to each other, so it's better to watch them in order. So in order to understand that patriarchal lens, we first really need to understand how history, as we know it, has come to be from a very high level. Now, this is not going to be a graduate level or even an undergraduate level course, maybe an introductory to that course. I am not a historian. I am not a scholar, but I have done years of research in trying to understand how I can understand, first and foremost, the Bible from a historical perspective as I was coming out of Christianity and its impact on history. And that's led me into the deeper understanding of this patriarchal lens that I keep talking about, and the book, The Creation of Patriarchy and the Creation of Feminine Consciousness by Gerda Lerner. I decided not to go back to get a master's or a doctorate in any of these fields because I really wanted to have an interdisciplinary look at history from the anthropologists, from the sociologists, from the New Testament biblical scholars, from the New Testament historical scholars. They're different, right? And cognitive memory, cognitive science, all these different disciplines. Really, we can't start to piece together our history in an accurate way unless we're really understanding all of these pieces. From my studies, I'm not sure that this is what scholars are doing. Bart Ehrman, in one of his books that I'm listening to now, Jesus Before the Gospels, he talks about how historians really don't look at some of the cognitive and psychological sciences when they're putting together history. Just a little side note there. Today, in this video, we are going to focus on what is historical method and how that has come about and how we might be able to use that as we're piecing together this patriarchal lens that I'm talking about. We're going to talk about where history, myth, and oral tradition all overlap. That's a really important piece of this puzzle. And we're going to understand by the end of this video why getting at absolute truth is much more complicated than you might have even thought coming into this video. You might have had that thought, and this is going to confirm that, or you maybe never even thought about any of this stuff, and this is a brand new field for you to really start to explore. I'm going to give you a lot of references so you can go and do your own research. I think that you'll also see by the end of this video and the end of this series that it's so complicated, it's so difficult to get at any absolute truth. And there's a really, really huge benefit to that I think we can use for our evolution and for the benefit of our society. So let's jump in. Have you ever stopped to ask, how do we really know what happened in the past with 100% certainty? Or there was any writing of the past or videos like we have today? I have done a lot of that. And what I have understood from my study is that history is more of a mosaic of incomplete stories, documents, and interpretations, but none of these are time capsules. None of them are time machines, and none of them are perfect. They're just puzzle pieces, and a lot of times historians have huge pieces of the puzzle missing. So how do we arrive at what we have been taught? Well, we need some kind of a method to collect data from the past, understand if that data is reliable or not, then put it together in a certain way and be able to interpret it. This is called the historical method. Keep in mind, though, that a lot of times there's huge missing part and a lot more that we'll get into. Let me read to you what Wiki says about the historical method. Historical method is the collection of techniques and guidelines that historians use to research and write histories of the past. So again, they're not just taking the data and giving us the data. They're writing the story, filling in the pieces as best as they can to that story. Keep that in mind. Secondary sources, primary sources, and material evidence such as that derived from archaeology may all be drawn on. And the historian's skill lies in identifying these sources, evaluating their relative authority, and combining their testimony appropriately in order to construct an accurate and reliable picture of past events and environment. I think Wiki maybe is a little strong in that word. We know that Wiki can always not be 100% accurate in itself, and I'll prove that to you as we go along here. The historical method can be broken down into three main steps. First, we need to be able to collect the data that will tell us about the past, if it's in existence, if we know about it yet. There's a lot of times where we construct a past and then we find more data that alters that past, such as the Nag Hammadi or Dead Sea Scrolls, which you'll hear me mention many times throughout this series or on this channel. And then within that first step, not only identifying those pieces, but also understanding the veracity, the truthfulness of those pieces that we can rely on, and the probability that those pieces actually were happening as they were. History really isn't about 100% accuracy as much as it is about the probability of something having happened in a certain way, we think. Number two, they recreate the past and tell us a story from that recreation. That is what gets in our history books and on YouTube channels nowadays. I do think we have a much more robust picture of some of the past, but as you'll learn later in this video, a lot of the past is always written by the people that could actually afford to write the past or who were victorious and could dominate the narrative of the past. So keep that in mind. And then three, we've already kind of talked about this, but the interpretation of these sources in context of the times that they were written in. So we talked about that in the last video, that writings have to be taken in context of the time, the language that was being used, the metaphors that were being used, the myths that were being used. All of that influences any particular piece of time and the people in that time to think in a certain way. So all of that has to be taken in context in order to create the hypothesis and establish the historical reason. Recapping, they have to find and identify pieces and then verify that they have veracity and probability of being accurate. They have to be able to recreate the past from those pieces, and then they have to interpret those pieces and write the story with as much accuracy accuracy as they believe they can within the context of understanding when and where these pieces were written. That is the historical method in a nutshell. I'm not sure if you can see some of the potential downfalls of that method and how incomplete it is. That is, in this 21st century, the best we have. I'm going to reiterate this again. All of this is only establishing probability of something having happened in the past, not 100% certainty of something happened in the past. Even in this modern age, we could have 500 different people filming an event that happened, and they would all be filming it from a different angle and a different bias. So what they're trying to capture might be different than the person next to them. We might not be able to fully pull together even what happened in the modern age. So how much more difficult is this to do out filming of the past that we do have today? But let's dive in a little bit deeper to understand how we can establish the probability of an event having occurred the way that it's written down. So here are some of the resources that source criticism, which is part of that historical method. If you go to the wiki page for historical method, you'll see this, have identified in order to come up with being able to ascertain the veracity and the probability of the accuracy of that document. Number one, when was the source written or unwritten? Because maybe it was an eyewitness account, maybe it was an archaeological piece of evidence produced. What was the date of that piece of written or unwritten source? And another question that they would ask is, if we have multiple sources, what's our earliest dated resource that would be the closest to the date? All right, so date, very important. We also are asking, where was it produced? Where was the localization of that document? So if something was happening in the Middle East back in, Jesus's time, and there was a document produced over in Mazatlan in Mexico, we might not want to count that as a reliable source because people didn't travel those great distances back then. So we want to make sure that the piece is produced as close to the actual location of the event or the person living as possible. One of the other things we're looking for was an actual historical location. There's a lot of things like Atlantis, which we still have not proved, that aren't necessarily historical. We don't know that they exist with 100% veracity, with 100% accuracy. Number three, by whom was it written? The authorship. So important. We're going to learn more about this later on, but you know where I'm going with this. I'm also going to talk about this at the end of the video, but is there a pseudonym? Was it written under a different name? Was it forged? There was a lot of forgery going on in the Middle East, where a lot of our history comes out of for the Western world. Number four, from what or was there any pre-existing material that this piece was made from, essentially? Was it produced from another piece? Can we identify an earlier piece that infuses the information into the piece that we're looking at for our historical reference? And again, they're going to be also doing this whole test with that piece. How verifiable was that pre-existing piece? Five, in what original form was that piece produced? Was it stone tablets? Was it papyrus? Was it pieces of pottery, writing on the cave walls, newspaper, film, video, all of those things? They have to know what it was produced on in its earliest form and be able to, again, interpret the language and do all of those other things that we've already looked at for the first 4 steps in this process of verifying the probability of this resource. And last but not least, in the source criticism, from what I could find, the 6th step would be, what is the evidential value of its contents? Is it credible? That seems like another common sense question. Lastly, there's a few other questions I wanted to bring in here that were not listed in the wiki definition of this historical method and source criticism. I got these questions additionally from Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament historical scholar that teaches at North Carolina at Duke. I just feel like these are also questions that we should have in the back of our minds. Maybe you want to rewind and get those first 6 questions, add these 6 questions, and have them in your toolbox when you start to look at some history or even modern data, whatever it is, and asking these questions. I think these are really vital questions that we need to be asking ourselves. 2 more questions he asked are, there multiple independent resources that are attributing to this story? So again, these can be used specifically for the Bible is what he's using them for, but I do believe that they can be used for history as well at large. The second question he often asks, is the story counter to the agenda of the storyteller? So one of the examples he uses is that women go to the tomb first first to see that Jesus is not there in the tomb. Therefore, that is something that would be counter to that context that we keep talking about in that day and age. So therefore, we can probably rely on that information have been somewhat probably true. There's a couple other valuations that he would use to make sure that that story is maybe true in order to say that it was historical. And there is a difference actually, and I'm going to throw this in here just to confuse us all, and we'll get more into this when we talk about myths, but just because a story is true doesn't mean it was actually historical. So let's take another example. Julius Caesar's assassination. We have multiple sources that state that it happened, but they all were written by non-eyewitness accounts. Since all of these accounts are independent sources, they didn't seem to collaborate with each other, but they do verify each other's stories. We can assume with a lot of accuracy and probability that Julius Caesar was indeed assassinated. So hopefully that gives you a good example of how they use the resources in order to be able to prove the probability of an event happening. This is important to remember about historians in general. This comes from Wiki again. Though historians agree on very general and basic principles, in practice, specific canons of historical proof are neither widely observed nor generally agreed upon among professional historians. If people are spending their entire lives studying resources and still cannot agree with each other on how to interpret, or maybe even, let's back up, verify and then interpret these documents, how are we to really know the past and 100% accuracy and if it's true, right? Maybe it's true, again, in the story sense, but it's not historically accurate. And we're relying on these people to write our history books that we're learning in our schools. And I don't know about you, but I never walked into a history class in high school and learned any of this. I was never made aware or given a warning that what you're about to learn had this amount of probability of being true. This is how we got to this history. Maybe they do that in modern history classes. I do not recall this happening. I mean, I remember being bored off my, in history class. And now I find history completely fascinating because of all of the stuff I'm talking about. But I never got a warning. Did you? I never got a warning that this is one way the past could have probably happened with those specific words. I was just told, remember these dates and facts, remember this interpretation because you're going to need it for the test. You're going to need it for your AP entrance exam. That's it. That's history. That's the facts, right? That is what we got coming out of school. But it's not 100% accurate. And there's probably other interpretations of the same data that we are never given in our history classes. And yet we take it as 100% factually true. Do you see where I'm going with all of history, mythology, and oral tradition overlap? It becomes even trickier to understand and get an accurate picture of the past. And this is because history and mythology often share the same DNA. And that's because until the invention of writing around 3400 BC, people passed down everything orally. And their stories evolved over time based on the cultural needs that the tribe or that community or that civilization needed in order to either survive, thrive, or overtake other communities. They did this in order to give their lives meaning. Nobody remembers history and facts. You give them a story with the facts in it and they will remember that. And that's where mythology was developed. It was developed in order to give people meaning and to put ritual around it so that they would remember it and pass it down from generation to generation. And what they did more than anything was to make sure that they put into that story, into that mythology, the really vital points that they needed future tribes to remember. I'm going to give you an example of this in a minute. But they would seed that story with those vital parts for the future generations to remember so that the tribe and its knowledge didn't get wiped out. Now, there could be good sides of this, like, technology and evolution through the technology side, but also what we're seeing, the patriarchal side, not such a good thing. Therefore, that's why it makes sense, doesn't it, that a lot of historical information evolved into mythology and vice versa, that mythology got taken as history. They overlapped. It was really hard, and it's still really hard sometimes to piece each of those out and understand what was mythology, a story that's true but not historically accurate, and what is actually historically accurate. Think about the Exodus story. If you don't know, it's the story where the Israelites were being held captive. They were slaves in Egypt. Moses came to the Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." There was 7 plagues, 10 plagues. Gosh, I'm forgetting my Bible facts. Yay! Anyways, there was a whole bunch of plagues, supposedly, and Pharaoh let them go. They went through the promised land. A lot of pastors and I would say probably Jewish rabbis now see this as a liberation myth in order to share the idea of what the divine does for us, what the God of the Bible does for us. He liberates us, right? I'm not preaching any message here, believe me. But there's actually no historical evidence to show that any of the plagues happened, that there was an exodus, that the Red Sea was divided in two so the Israelites could walk across it on bare land, and that the sea then therefore came back down onto the Egyptians and wiped them out so that the Israelites could be set free, that they wandered in the desert for 40 years. There's none of this data in our archaeological evidence or any of the other resources, because there was writing at this point in time that would point to that story being actually historically accurate. There's a true story in there about liberation and what liberation can do for us, but it's not a historically accurate story. So I hope you're getting to see the difference here. Another example we could take, Battle of Troy. What we know of it, there is historical evidence of wars that happened in and around Troy, probably about the year that it was placed in Homer's Odyssey, but most of what we know about the Battle of Troy comes from Homer's Odyssey, which we know and everybody in this modern age accepts as a literary myth describing this historical event. So again, a lot of interbreeding of these two things of history and myth interbreeding with each other. I'm going to say this in many different ways when we get to talk about myths a little bit more, but myths are not just bedtime stories. They're not falsehoods by any stretch of the imagination. They're not just these glorified hero journeys that we turn into movies nowadays, but they're actually these cultural DNA narratives that are embedded in such a way that we want to learn from them and take them into the next generations. They're very catchy, if you will. They are contagious. And they did this. They blended their history into this mythology in order to help give their lives meaning. It was a form of their psychology before psychology was even invented. This overlap, I think you can see, matters so much more that we understand in this present age if we want to get out of patriarchy, because it shows us that history wasn't just about facts for the ancients. It was about giving people meaning in their lives. It was about what stories they chose to preserve in order to help their tribe, their community, their civilization preserve throughout time, both in good ways and in bad ways. I'm going to give you one more example to finish this section out. Elaine Pagels, who is another New Testament historian, she wrote a book, Why Religion? And she was talking about how she has kind of ebbed and flowed with her own spiritual journey as she's studied the Bible and studied the history and the theology of it, which are two separate things. The story of the Bible isn't always what we think it is, and then there's the theology. Here's a little passage that she wrote in her book, Why Religion? Reading the biblical story this time, I could see how it wasn't about God creating nature, but about the stories creating the culture. Whether we believe them or not, they are transmitted. My words, it becomes our cultural DNA and is powerfully shaping our attitudes towards work, gender, sexuality, and death. The first story tells us how to use our sexual energy to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The stories only make sense when we actually look at them from the lens of who is telling them and listening to them, i.e. the context of the time of those people, and the idea, I'm adding this, of it being a patriarchal lens that they didn't even know they were looking at history through at that point. Back to her word. This first story of creation, probably told orally for hundreds of years before it was written down about 3,000 years ago, transmits the nomadic code that we would have needed. Their survival depended upon their fertility. That's the story of Genesis, y'all. It's not about how God created it that was important to them. It was about what they needed to do in order to have meaning and to survive as a tribe. Just a few more points points in this section about how history and mythology are intertwined. They're in bed with each other, y'all. They love each other. Maybe not. Maybe it's a love-hate relationship. There is a French philosopher. His name was Maurice Holbach, and he was a philosopher and a sociologist known for developing the concept of collective memory. In this quote from him, we can see the indivisible nature between mythology and history. Collective memory is essentially a reconstruction of the past that adapts the image of historical facts to the beliefs and spiritual needs of the present. Mythos is what we call that. This is why this idea of collective memory, how we take ideas from the past and adapt them to modern needs, is why fields like religious history, democracy, and social justice are contested fields, meaning it's really, really difficult to get any historical accuracy with these fields. And yet, think about it, history has been written a lot by the Bible, even though it's a contested field in this day and age. Here's another little fun fact I just learned from listening to one of Bart's latest podcast, Misquoting Jesus episodes. He talked about how most people, even scholars and pastors and priests and the universities, believed that the Bible was historical accuracy facts up until about 1770. So into the 18th century, people believed it was history. So, so much is wrong with that. I hope you can see that. Let me know in the comments what you're thinking right now. Here's a little bit more of why they're a contested field. It's because they're not relying on just the facts, the verifiable facts of history, but they're also relying on the cultural myths and the interpretations of those cultural myths in order to interpret the past or make sense of the past. So when we examine religious texts and cultural identity stories, we're actually encountering that blend between probable events and mythical meaning, which we're now taking as 100% accurate instead of understanding that they're a blend of the two. We're encountering myth as history and history as myth. Here's a quote. I'm not sure where I got it from. I tried to research it and I don't know. I don't know where I got it from. Maybe I made it up. I'm not taking credit for it though. But without myths, history is a skeleton, rigid and lifeless. Isn't that powerful? I mean, I think we can all attest to how boring learning history was in high school versus some of the historical novels, again, which are fiction, myth, and history. And you'll learn a lot more about that as I go along. I'm writing a historical fiction novel about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist and Essenes and the Qumran community and all of that. That's how I got into history in the first place. History without myth is just lifeless and rigid. I think we can all attest to that. The last then, again, as I gave you the example, 500 people reporting on the same standing of how oral tradition has impacted all of this. If you want to learn more, I would highly encourage you to listen to or read that book by Bart Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels, because he does in that book take cognitive sciences, behavioral sciences, psychology, sociology, all of these different fields into thinking about the historical accuracy of the Bible through the oral tradition. Again, I'm going to reiterate, for written history started about 3400 BCE, and that was in Sumer. We passed everything down orally. Now, some people would say, oh, they had a better memory back then because that's all they had, and so they drilled themselves into memory. Cognitive sciences are proving now that that is not any more true back then than it is in this day and age. Again, back in 3400 BCE or before then, they didn't have systematic systems for going to school and learning material. All they had was that campfire experience, we're assuming, of sitting around the campfire and hearing the stories over and over and over again. And just to reiterate, just because they're ancients and they only had oral tradition doesn't make them have better memories than we do today. Those stories from the oral tradition, we can piece together, cultures that are still in existence today that have an oral tradition, or people that have come out of that lineage, like Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She wrote the book Women Who Run with Wolves. She counts herself as a cantadora, as a storyteller. And in this book, she talks about the role of the storyteller. So I am assuming that this is probably what happened. Again, I don't have historical proof on this, but just like a lot of tribes back in the ancient days when they were more nomadic, or, like what was called selective agriculture, they had people that maybe were a little bit more skilled in healing. So they became either the healers or the shamans, the people that you would go to when you were sick, the nurses of that day. They had the midwives, because gynecology has been around for thousands of years. They had storytellers, and those storytellers would basically study with the elder storytellers storyteller and learn the stories of the tribe and learn that there's multiple ways to tell the story depending on the needs. She talks about when she's telling a story orally, she often goes into this trance-like state where she's really trying to feel the energy, feel the emotion, feel the needs in the room in order to know which way to go with the direction of the story in order to give the medicine that the story gives for the healing that might need to be happening through that story. So these stories were evolving over time until they became cemented more so with writing. If you take this on a collective scale, the storytellers would have been taking the pulse of the entire tribe, especially if the tribe needed more land for their selective agriculture as agriculture grew, or there was a warring tribe across the way because they took their land. That's a whole other process that we talked about more in the first couple of videos of how slavery came to be. So what would they do in order to motivate and unify and get a cohesiveness in the tribe together is they crafted their stories as if they were histories of the tribe to show the divinity being with the tribe in order to help the men go out and battle in that war with the other tribes. See where I'm going with all that? The power of stories, especially in their collective identities and the power it can give us in a collective identity cannot be understated. I hope you're getting that from this lesson here. These powerful stories of collective identity help unify, motivate, inspire, and drive one tribe to survive and perhaps even wipe out the neighboring tribe. This means that the foundation of our earliest recorded histories, like the stories in Genesis, come from those oral traditions that were shaped, edited, and remembered based on their cultural need, i.e. the meaning making that they were doing with these stories, rather than strict factual recounting. In that book by Bart Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels, where he's talking about the understanding how memory plays into these stories that we know and we think of as historical versus mythology, he says this: cognitive psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists have shown that individual and collective memory are not lawless records of the past. They're reconstructions of memory shaped by emotion, bias, and cultural context, i.e. that means the past is not a fixed entity back there in time. It is always being transformed in our minds, depending on what our minds are occupied with the here and now. I hope this sounds similar to a quote we looked at a few minutes ago by Maurice Halbach, that French philosopher and sociologist, where he said collective memory is essentially a reconstruction of the past that adapts the image of historical fact to the beliefs and spiritual needs of the present, i.e. mythos. Let's take a step back again. Isn't this what pastors and politicians are constantly doing with our religious and collective identity stories? They're taking those stories in a sermon or in a speech and reinterpreting for modern ears and giving it meaning and context through our modern day lives in order to direct us to the point of what they see that story as, because they're reading that story through their patriarchal, maybe Christian nationalist lens. All of this that we've done so far points to the fact that history is much more of a mirage based on the evidence that we have from the past, who it was written by, who's not being heard from the past, as we'll see next, and what the motivation of that person telling the story today is in order to relate their point, their biases, their emotions to us. History is not actual data and facts. It's much more of a mirage. Anything, I hope that's what you take away from this entire life. So if history is shaped by memory, myth, and interpretation, can we ever really know what happened in the past with absolute certainty? Probably not. As we saw in the first couple of points, recreating the past is murky at best. It's a mirage. It's really difficult to do with a lot of veracity or accuracy and probability at the same time. Unless we had some magic ability to disappear through the stones at Craignadoon and Outlanders with fully charged phones and in a way to actually charge the phones once they ran out to film history, we're never going to know with 100% accuracy what happened. Even then, again, as I gave you the example, 500 people reporting on the same incident still would report 500 different variations of that incident. So history is really, really murky. Let's look at a couple other reasons just to add to the murky pool of history as to why it's really difficult to get at the past with any clarity. Number one, historical records are reflecting a certain bias and perspective of the people telling that historical record in the past. Two, those creators of the past generally were the men who ruled or conquered or were victorious in battle, and they had the privilege of telling the past how they wanted to tell the past. Now, sometimes you will see, that they lost battles and they tell about that in their annals or whatever they're called. But in general, that's still talking about a very masculine world in which the dominator concepts that we talked about in video 1 and 2 is ruling the interpretation of those events of the past. They've left out all of the common folks, which is number 3. We have detailed records of kings and queens and the conquerors, but we have really very few stories of the common folks, of the majority of the people that have lived on this planet. We don't know what their daily lives were like. We don't know if they had big accomplishments. Unless you have done something major to contribute to civilization, you have not gotten written into the history books. And even then, if you weren't a conqueror, a king, a male, in a privileged position or class, you probably maybe had your invention or your accomplishment adapted to one of those other people and your name got wiped out throughout of history. We can't even for sure know that that wasn't happening. I know in my own marriage, because I was in a submissive, marriage of the church, it was very common for women to do the work and men to take the credit for it. So we can't put that over not happening in the past. And number 4, I'm going to spend some more time here really unpacking this one, is the authorship and the ability to transcribe by hand with 100% accuracy from generation to generation these documents that we have built our history on are not 100% accurate, as you might already know. There's a lot of contextual irregularities and variability from one copy to the next. Now, this is my own little interpretation here, is that this is where, in oral stories I mentioned, they would often change or redirect the story to a different ending or a different path. It's like choose your own adventure type books. They did that based on the needs of their tribe or the person listening to the story. So I think this is why, oftentimes we see contextual variations from generation to generation over thousands of years. Writing probably slowed down the changing of these stories because they did have it written down, but it didn't stop the changing of the stories based on the cultural needs. And I think that that's what we're seeing in the contextual variation. It's not just mishaps, because we know it's not just mishaps. There's differences contextually in these different variations. And I think that's what we're seeing. That's my own take. I have not seen that anywhere, but that's what I get from this. A great video for this that came into my inbox just the night before I thought I was going to film this was this video that I'm going to show you a couple clips of from here by Alex O'Connor at Cosmic Skeptic over on YouTube. And he's talking about refuting this gentleman that went on the Joe Rogan show talking about the Dead Sea Scroll, the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll, specifically Isaiah 1QA, and how Wes, the gentleman Joe Rogan, said with 100% accuracy, this Dead Sea Scroll now gave us a document of Isaiah that was 1,000 years earlier than what we currently have that has made the Bible as we know it today. And there's no variations. It's 100% the same. Now, that wasn't actually accurate. But as you know, or maybe as you don't know, Joe Rogan is is the biggest podcast in the world. And now we have this gentleman telling the world on this biggest podcast that this is a historical fact. And it's not. Can you see the issue with history when it's told like this? Now, if you're not familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were documents that were found in 1947 that were written somewhere around the turn of BCE to CE, so around the time that Jesus was alive. These documents were in part, and sometimes in almost the fullness, as in Isaiah 1QA, of the Old Testament, or what we would call the Old Testament. That would just be their Bible of that day. That would have been their scriptures of that day. The Qumran community that lived there that ended up burying these documents when they had to flee. This is what we suspect happened. And the reason I'm bringing this video up is if you care to go watch it, you will see Alex refute Wes, who was on the Joe Rogan show, saying there was no variations between this 1,000-year earlier document at the Dead Sea Scrolls and the document that was used to translate into our modern day Bible, the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible, the Masoretic text, which was made made in the Middle Ages, that there was no variations, that they were 100% the same, because of course many Christians and even probably Jewish people want to prove that God was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But these documents don't do that. Alex in his video shows you that there was 2,600 plus variations, contextual variations, not just spelling, but contextual variations between the 1,000-year older document and the document that has made our Bible today. That is a huge amount. 2,600 variations, contextual variations between the two that happened over a 1,000-year period. This proves my point in so many ways that history cannot be 100% reliable. Here's the other thing that I just have to point out. Alex does a great job in his video at the very end. He has another scholar come on and share with us that basically in ancient manuscripts, it on average between 92 to 95%, between transcribe and transcribe and transcribe over the centuries or over the millennia, that was the accuracy between the transcript, whatever that word is. But that means that somewhere between 5 to 8% got shifted or changed on average. Now, sometimes there was more, sometimes there was less, but Wes, because he's trying to prove that the Bible doesn't change, that's why he misquoted. And he did do a retraction video, but it really still left you questioning whether or not he believed that it was the same. Anyways, you can go watch it all because Alex does a great job with this. But it just basically goes to show that all ancient manuscripts have that percentage. The Bible is not unique. And I point that out because we're going to be talking about the Bible more coming up in the next couple videos, especially as I get into my own testimony. As I talk about my exodus out of the Christian church, the Bible is important. The Bible is important because it's been used as a foundation for a lot of our Western culture. The stories have created our culture as if they were historically accurate. Again, I mentioned that earlier in this video, that up until about 1700, so 18th century, people believed that the Bible was historically accurate. And so that is an example of how powerful mythology and history blending and in bed with each other can be, because we've now constructed our world based on mythology, not based on actual history, and we're reaping the consequences of that. And that's why there's a channel called Deconstructing Patriarchy. I'm trying to bring all of this out so we can see it and understand how we're seeing the world is through this patriarchal lens that is not historically accurate, but it's mythology. To finish up this point, let's just watch this quick video from Dan McClellan as he says exactly what I've been trying to say in this video in much more succinct words.
If you just want them to be evidence that the Bible hasn't changed, you lose. Like, you can characterize them and you can squint at them and you can try to come up with fuzzy rhetoric, but if you are taking a hard critical look at the data, what it shows is that there is still quite a bit of textual fluidity, and we're seeing the developmental accretion of text to the Bible, and Isaiah 2, 9b through 10 is a perfect example of that. That is
Now, to finish this last murky point of how history is a mirage, we have to touch on something about the forgery that was happening in ancient text, because it was super common, especially in the Bible. I'm going to put the link down below to Bart Ehrman's post that he writes on how many books he suspects were actually written by the authors that claim to be the authors. He spells it out really clearly for you. How many were anonymous, how many were homonymous, which means they sounded like a famous person, but they weren't. The John that wrote Revelation, think of him as John that wrote the Gospel John, the beloved of Christ, but he wasn't. He just had a similar name. How many were forged or plagiarized, essentially, meaning that they were writing under Paul's name. This is a really great example, but actually were not Paul letters. And how many were actually written under the correct name? So his breakdown of this for the Bible, for the New Testament, is 6 to 9 were anonymous writers. We don't actually know. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not actually written by a Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that were the disciples. They were written decades later after Jesus had died, and they were not written by immediate disciples of Jesus. They know that much. There was one that was written by homonymous, I'm going to say that 5 times fast. That was the book of Revelation, John, I already mentioned. Forged writings were 10 to 13, and coming in at the lowest was the actual authors of the writings of the New Testament were 7 books. I just have to bring that point up because if somebody's writing under a false name as if they were Paul, and then that gets taken into a historical accurate event, such as what we have seen the Bible as for most of its life. Mythology that got taken as history is taught down through culture, because Bible used to be taught in university as a major one of the courses. It wasn't just the side thing that you took if you had curiosity or were going to become a pastor or a biblical scholar. It was one of your main courses. That's how integral the Bible has been in our history. And so you can start to see how much of this mythology of the Bible has gotten imprinted into our DNA as if it was factual history, to the point where we can't distinguish the two at this point in time. We just assume that that's all there was ever in our culture. And in this day and time where YouTube has been so prolific, we're starting to understand there was a lot of other gods and goddesses throughout all of time. Their stories are being resurrected. And we understand that they're stories and that they're not this 100% certainty that God is real and it's real in only this way and it's 100% factual and it's 100% historical. We understand that that's not what the case is, but we still have a lot of work to undo the 2,000 years of taking the Bible as history. This doesn't mean that history is useless. That's not what I'm saying. It might feel like that's what I'm saying. I think there's a time and a place for history, but we have to look at it through a critical lens and follow up with a really big question. So 1, we have to understand who's writing it. 2, what their motivation is. And 3, what is missing? Whose voices are missing from that history? Because that's probably the majority of what history actually was, the missing voices. The biggest question, though, I'm going to leave you with today is this one. If history is this jumbled mess of murky waters that we can't really get our hands around, if it's this mosaic, then why are we putting so much weight into history and building our current lives based on this murky looking past? And we're also putting this idea on ancients that they knew something we didn't know, that they knew something about the divine and about the planet and about life that we didn't know in our modern age, when it's actually the reverse is true. Because of science and because of evolution, we know more about those things in this day and age. But we keep putting more weight as if these people were more intelligent and wiser and more spiritually attuned. They just didn't have the benefit of society, so they had to rely more on mythology and the mythological world. So there you have it. That's my big question that I'm going to leave you with. Have to remember these key points as we move forward into our next couple of videos. 1, most of history is not knowable. We haven't heard from most of the voices of the past, and therefore we don't really know what the full picture of the history looked like. Even the history we do have is not an accurate picture. It's very murky at best. Number 2, what we do know of history is often a collective memory bank that was using that idea of collective memory where we adapted the facts of the past to meet the cultural and spiritual needs of the present. And number 4, most importantly, everything, unless you've done the work that I've talked about in this channel, it doesn't have to be in the specific way that I'm doing it, but unless you've done the work to peel off the patriarchal lens, most or all of history that we know of today is being taught and interpreted through a patriarchal lens. And that is the main point of this channel, is to help you understand that. So when you look back at history, when people tell you, oh, it was definitely this way, you have all of the facts that you've just gone through in this video with me and all the future videos that we're going to go through with mythology and understanding even more about these two fields, and be able to say, well, actually, have you thought about it through this lens? You don't have to say patriarchal, and you'll be able to show them a whole new world. And here's why I think this is so important, is as we've seen, history / mythology are in bed with each other. They've developed our current culture in a way that we think is historically accurate, but is much more likely to be mythologically accurate, if that's even a word. They're also driving us into the future unless we change those stories. I'm so excited for the next video because we're going to dive into mythology more and really understanding mythology. I've given you a little hint that mythology is often true stories, but not historically accurate. I'm going to give you a lot more quotes to understand what mythology is. Please join me in the next video. Make sure you've gone back and watched the other videos if you finished this one before.
I don't know about you, but watching that again and again and again as I was editing it, my blood starts to boil because we have been misled about what history is in our history books from people that teach it. They don't share any of that information, as you just heard me say. Let's jump into our challenge today and watch this video from the Great Courses. It's a subscription you can get on Prime if you'd like, and it's in a course about the ancient four civilizations. So you have the Mesopotamia, the Egyptian, the Indus Valley, and one other that I'm totally spacing on. It's just blowing my mind that he can't even answer these questions. My challenge is to you is, can you answer the questions that he's bringing up here from his point of view based on watching these first 4 1/3 of the episode? Can you answer the question as to why we don't have answers for the things that he's saying we don't have answers for? Take a look. What do you think?
As we've seen, of the 4 great earliest civilizations, the culture of the Indus Valley was the very last to be discovered, and it remains by far the most mysterious and ill understood. It's the only one of these for which we cannot yet decipher the writing, and so many fundamental questions persist, even about basic aspects of what was once a flourishing culture. We know almost nothing about the political structure. We know almost nothing about the religious beliefs. There are questions which are intriguing. For example, in their art, there are very few images of warfare, and this has led some to suggest that maybe it was a typically peaceful society. There also don't seem to be any of the standard sorts of figures we see depicted in art, such as priests or kings. And that's kind of strange when compared to most other cultures of this era. Similarly, archaeologists haven't been able to clearly identify even any structures which they can firmly say was a palace or a temple, which are absolutely standard features of every other early civilization. There's little archaeological evidence for political or religious hierarchy, or even a centralized state. And without those sorts of institutions, it's hard for us to understand all the standardization and coordination and specialization that we see in these cities. How could they build such an extensive infrastructure if they didn't have a centralized government? Well, at least for now, those are questions which we simply don't know the answers to. And all we have to go on are those physical ruins and artifacts of what was once a vast and sophisticated culture. Historians sometimes don't like to admit ignorance, but at times, really the most accurate and honest history that one can write is to freely admit what we don't yet know.
Me doing this work, I clearly could see he had not read the creation of patriarchy and therefore was missing this huge piece of work that was out there that might have helped him be able to have some more answers. And this unfortunately is the case with a lot of historians, is they look at it from the patriarchal lens, they only look at it from the dominator lens, and they don't know or haven't done enough research to understand that there were other types of societies prior to the start of patriarchy. And those societies spilled over, surprise, surprise, into patriarchy. So what you're seeing in Indus Valley, in my opinion, again, I'm not a scholar, everything that he mentions, the lack of any hierarchy, the lack of any government structure that we're used to within patriarchy, it doesn't mean they didn't have a governmental structure. It's just they're looking for what they're used to within patriarchy and they're not finding it. So it just baffles them, right? They don't find palaces and temples like you would find in other patriarchal societies. For everything that he's saying there, it points to a partnership type of society. And as we know, or maybe I haven't said this yet, partnership societies tend to be more civil and less warlike, and they don't want to go to war, and they get taken over by the patriarchal or by the dominator societies. So I hope you got that one. If not, keep watching these videos. Go back and rewatch them, because again, I've been working with this material now for 10, 12, 15 years. And it took me that long to be able to put this kind of course together for you. And I'm watching it over and over and over again as I'm editing it. But then I'm also watching it to help me get the hours I need to get monetized on YouTube. So I am swimming in this information. And so it's becoming super simple for me to identify. And that's what I want for you and everybody else as well. Please make sure you share this video, share the challenge. I think that was one of my maybe more favorite challenges we've had. And I'll continue to look for episode 5
5 is done. We have talked about what is history and how we even get at making history. We've talked about how oral, tradition, myth, and history are all in bed with each other, and it's really hard to parse those out. We've also obviously talked about why it's so complicated to get at any 100% accuracy within history. So here is your challenge this week. I want you to take one myth that you know and rewrite it from a different angle, especially maybe more of that partnership, matriarchal, matrilineal perspective. The one I would suggest, maybe just saying, is the creation story of Genesis. How would you write that if it had been a matrilineal partnership type society? If you need some help, definitely go back and watch my 1A through 1D videos to understand how we built the patriarchy, right? If you don't remember that. And then go check out Rain Eisler's work with her partnership societies. That would also really help you. But I think just get creative. What would you like to see if it wasn't a patriarchal story, but a matrilineal story? And then if you can, share that on TikTok and tag me. I'm really active over on TikTok. I'm going to put a call out over there as well. If I remember, Holly McCormick, I think it's Holly C. McCormick over there. Or you can share it here if you have your own YouTube channel and tag me. And let's start building this vault of new stories, rewriting the old stories, but making them better and more creative and more practical for this day and age. What do you think? All right. Ready, set, go. Bye-bye. Jumping on here one more time because I totally forgot that I did this assignment. Yes, I did this assignment with the Sacred Tryst. I used Genesis as my model of a creation story I was rewriting, and I rewrote it as genetrics, which means ancestress, I believe in Greek. I can't even remember what I did. But if you'd like access to that, then head over to my Substack. If you're already here, then that means you already have access to it. If not, then head over to Substack, hollymccormick.substack.com. A link is down below, and subscribe to any of the investor paid levels, and you'll be able to have access to the book I'm writing. Is flipping on its head the idea of who the Christ is. It's actually going to be Mary Magdalene, and she's going to teach Jesus everything she needs to know. But it starts with introducing this new creation story. That will be released on March 26th of 2025. Not sure when you're watching this, might already be there. It's $5 a month, $50 a year, or if you want to be in the investor level, I think it's 111 in that investor level, 111. All right, so much love. Go enjoy and have some fun with this. Bye-bye.